The wipers on Elias Voss's rust-eaten F250 were losing the argument against the storm. He'd been fighting Blackwood Pass for the better part of 40 minutes, 20 miles of two-lane blacktop, that the State Highway Department had officially closed 3 hours ago. He knew that. He'd driven through the barricade anyway, because the alternative was spending another night in that motel outside Durango, where the heating unit rattled like a dying animal, and the walls were thin enough to let in every sound. Every sound was the problem. Every sound was the enemy. The wind hit the driver's side glass in a solid gust, and the whole cab shuddered. That was all it took. The sound morphed. Not wind anymore incoming. The shriek of a mortar round dropping at an angle the way they sounded in the Korengal, when the insurgents walked them in from the ridge. Elias's hands locked on the wheel knuckles going bone white. His chest cavity turned to concrete. He stopped breathing the way a civilian stops breathing. He stopped breathing the way a man stops breathing when he is counting the seconds between sound and impact and calculating whether he needs to move or whether moving will kill him faster than staying still. Kandahar. No, the pass. The pass. His right foot found the brake, and he ground the truck to a slow crawl on the shoulder. Couldn't trust his foot on the gas. Couldn't trust anything attached to his body right now. The windshield fogged with his own rapid exhale. The tach dropped. The engine knocked once. The engine. He was back in the ditch outside FOB Salerno, and Martinez was in the ditch on the other side of the road, and Martinez wasn't moving, and the radio was gone, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the next one to Havoc moved. Not a gentle nudge. The Belgian Malinois came off the passenger seat like a sprung trap, 72 pounds of focused, deliberate animal, and drove his muzzle hard into the hollow between Elias's jaw and his collarbone. A single low rumble in the dog's chest. Not aggressive, not alarmed. The sound a tuning fork makes when you strike it against something real. Here. Right here. I'm here. Elias exhaled. The sound that came out of him was ugly and compressed, the kind of sound a man makes when he's been holding something underwater for too long. He pressed his palm flat against the side of Havoc's neck and felt the warmth radiating through the short fur, felt the pulse there, steady, even completely unbothered by the storm. 60 seconds. Maybe 90. Elias came back. He always came back. That was the deal he and Havoc had worked out over 3 years of nights exactly like this, one different geography, same darkness. The dog pulled him out. Elias kept the dog fed and warm and off the euthanasia list at the Pueblo County shelter where he'd found him. Fair exchange. Some days it felt like the only fair exchange left in his life. He scratched behind Havoc's left ear. The dog's tail was a barely perceptible lean into the pressure, like he was too professional to admit he liked it, and looked out at the road. Whiteout. Nothing moving. Visibility down to the length of a parking space. Good boy, Elias said, and the words came out hoarser than he intended. Havoc returned to his seat, circled once dropped. His amber eyes stayed on Elias's face with the unblinking focus of a sentry who hasn't been relieved yet. Elias pulled back onto the road. 5 miles to the turnoff, then 12 down into Ridgecrest, where his sister kept a room made up for him that he never used but liked knowing existed. He pressed the accelerator and watched the snow come at the headlights in a long hypnotic collapse. He was just beginning to feel his hands again when the dark behind him exploded blue and red. The light hit the rearview mirror like a slap. Elias squinted against it, confused for a half second, before his brain processed the pattern light bar cruiser police, and he felt the low reflexive clench of a man who has spent enough time in hostile territory to mistrust anything that moves toward him fast and without warning. He pulled over, killed the engine, put both hands on top of the steering wheel where they could be seen. Havoc lifted his head. His ears rotated forward. Elias stared into the mirror at the cruiser idling 30 feet behind him, light bar throwing insane color across the surface of the snow. No silhouette yet. The officer wasn't getting out. The protocol was automatic, carved into muscle memory from 12 years of operating in places where cooperation bought you seconds and seconds bought you life. Hands visible. No sudden movement. Wait to be addressed. He waited. Outside, the temperature, according to the dash gauge, was 11 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. The wind was gusting at what he estimated was 40 miles an hour, across open ground, higher through the cut in the ridge where the road bent west. The State Patrol had issued a travel ban on this exact stretch at 6 p.m., which meant there should be no patrol car on Blackwood Pass tonight. There should be no one out here at all. Havoc made a sound Elias had never quite been able to categorize, low-sustained somewhere between a whine and a growl. He only made it when something was wrong in a way he couldn't name yet. The cruiser door opened. The officer who stepped out of that cruiser moved wrong. Elias clocked it in the first 3 seconds, the way a man who has spent years reading bodies in low-visibility conditions clocks it without thinking. The officer wasn't hunched against the wind, wasn't moving with the cautious, braced posture of someone fighting 40-mile-an-hour gusts. He walked like the storm wasn't there, like he owned the mountain and everything the mountain swallowed. Big man. 6'2", maybe more. Name tag on the chest, said Declan. He carried the DUI club, the heavy aluminum flashlight, in his right hand, and he was already slapping it against his own thigh in a slow, rhythmic beat before he'd closed half the distance. Elias kept his hands on the wheel. Declan reached the driver's side and didn't knock. He swung the butt of the flashlight hard against the glass, 3 sharp cracks that made Havoc lurch upright on the passenger seat. Elias rolled down the window 6 inches. License, registration, proof of insurance. No greeting. No, sir. The flashlight beam went straight into Elias's eyes and stayed there. Elias reached for the glove box, slowly narrating every movement the way he'd been trained. Reaching for the glove compartment. Registrations inside. He retrieved the documents and his wallet in one clean pull, held them out through the gap. Declan took the wallet, flipped it open, shone the beam on the contents. His eyes moved across the Montana driver's license, the vehicle registration, the VA medical card, and stopped on the dark blue card behind it. The Department of Defense identification. The honorable discharge certificate folded behind that. He let a beat pass. 2 beats. Then he dropped the wallet onto the snow. It landed face down in the accumulation beside the door. Elias watched it disappear under a skin of fresh powder and felt something old and controlled and very dangerous shift behind his sternum. "Step out of the vehicle," Declan said. "Officer, can I ask the basis for—" "I said step out." The flashlight swung to the door handle. Elias stepped out. The cold hit him like a wall, instant total, the kind of cold that finds every gap in clothing within the first 10 seconds. He stood with his hands at shoulder-height, boots 6 inches apart in the snow, and looked at Declan's face. What he saw there was not anger exactly. Anger had heat in it. What Declan had was something colder than the air between them. "You know what I see," Declan said, circling slowly to position himself between Elias and the truck door. "I see a beat-up truck with a cracked taillight driving a closed road registered to an address that doesn't exist anymore." He tilted his head. "And I see a face I've seen on a report. You one of those boys they cut loose from Bragg. One of those Section 8 cases that can't hold a job and can't stop jumping at their own shadow." Elias said nothing. That was a technique to silence as a weapon, as a wall. "I'm going to search this vehicle," Declan said, "for your safety and mine. You don't have probable cause." The words came out flat and clean, and Declan's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. Elias filed it away. "I smell marijuana," Declan said. "No, you don't." A silence stretched between them across the howling dark. Havoc was standing on the passenger seat now, nose pressed to the gap in the window, watching Declan with that fixed professional attention that looked lazy until you understood what it meant. Declan's hand moved, not for the sidearm, for the black device on his opposite hip. He had the taser up and leveled before Elias could process the transition, and then 50,000 volts hit him in the upper chest, and the world became a white, screaming erasure. He went down. The snow came up and met him. His muscles locked in a full-body contraction that turned his skeleton into something temporary, something that might not hold. He was aware of the cold against his face and the sound of the wind, and somewhere underneath it all, Havoc not barking yet, but that sound again, that low, unnamed sound climbing in register. Declan's weight came down on him, a knee in the center of his back, the cold steel of handcuffs finding his wrists and ratcheting tight, too tight, the kind of tight that's a message, not a precaution. His arms were wrenched up and back, and the cuffs locked around the metal crash barrier at the road's edge with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He was pinned to the side of the road in a blizzard on a closed pass with his hands behind him. Declan crouched down, brought his mouth close to Elias's ear, close enough that his words cut through the wind without being raised. "Nobody knows you're up here," he said. "Road's closed. No cameras on this stretch. A man with your history, PTSD, volatile, no fixed address, drives into a whiteout and doesn't come out." He made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "That's a tragedy, not a crime. By morning, you'll be a cold case nobody opens." He stood up, brushed the snow off his uniform pants. "Nothing personal," he said. "You're just in the way." Havoc did not whine. He did not pace. He did not claw at the window the way a panicked animal claws at something it doesn't understand. He stood on the passenger seat with his muzzle pressed to the 6-inch gap in the glass and watched Declan walk back toward the cruiser, and something inside him calculated. Elias saw it happen. From the ground, cheek against the snow arms, locked to the barrier behind him, he watched his dog's body language shift through something that looked almost mechanical in its precision. Ears up, head tracking. The short fur along Havoc's spine rose in a single flat ridge. Then the window gave. It didn't shatter, the glass had been cracked since October, a rock chip that spiderwebbed when the temperature dropped, and Havoc's shoulder hit it at exactly the angle that finished the job. The pane collapsed outward in a sheet. Havoc came through behind it and landed in the snow without a sound, all 4 feet finding purchase simultaneously, and then he was up and moving. Declan heard the glass and turned. "Hey." He reached for his sidearm. Havoc crossed the gap between the truck and the cruiser in a straight line that didn't deviate, not toward Elias pinned at the barrier, not toward Declan reaching for his weapon. Straight to the cruiser, the rear of it. The trunk. Declan got the gun clear of the holster. The shot was hurried, badly aimed. Even Elias, flat on the ground, with his vision swimming from the taser, understood that. The round caught Havoc along the right flank, a grazing impact that spun the dog a half-step sideways and put a sound into the air that Elias had never heard before and would never be able to describe accurately afterward. Not a yelp, not a scream. Something shorter and more honest than either. A single note of pure, involuntary pain. Havoc staggered. 1 step. 2. Then he turned back to the trunk. A red smear followed him across the white snow. His right rear leg wasn't tracking correctly, the muscle group along the flank had seized, and he was moving with a rolling, compensated gait that should have been stopping him, that any reasonable reading of biology said should have been stopping him. He reached the trunk and started working it, not clawing the way a dog scratches at a door to be let in. Specific, deliberate impacts with both front paws against the seam of the lid, and alongside it the bark. Elias had heard Havoc bark in play, in frustration, in alarm. This was none of those. This was the compressed staccato series he'd been trained to produce in one specific context. 3 short bursts, a pause, 3 more. The alert sequence. The one the handler certification manual described as reserved for confirmed detection of explosives, live victims, or critical evidence. Havoc only used it when the stakes were absolute. Declan's face changed. Elias watched it from the ground and filed every detail. The gun hand dropped 6 inches. The color went out of the man's face in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, The blood didn't drain, it retreated like something pulling back from a perimeter. His eyes went to the trunk and stayed there. Whatever was in that car, Declan had just been told that Elias now knew something was in that car. Havoc's bark cut through the storm in those short, sharp bursts, relentless bleeding into the snow, his body braced against the lid of the trunk with a focus so complete it looked like the wound wasn't registering anymore. Maybe it wasn't. Elias had seen that before too in the valley outside Kandahar. He'd run 400 meters on a leg that an ER doctor later told him shouldn't have supported his weight. The body overrides itself when the mission is the only thing left. Havoc had a mission. "Shut up," Declan said. Low, then louder. "Shut that dog up!" Havoc did not shut up. Declan raised the weapon again. His hand wasn't steady this time. His hand was doing something Elias had seen in hostile combatants who'd just realized the engagement wasn't going the way they'd planned, a fine, almost invisible tremor that started at the wrist. The gun was aimed at Havoc's head from 8 feet. Elias felt the cuffs bite into his wrists as every muscle in his body pulled toward the dog. 3 years. 3 years of 3 a.m. bathroom floors and shaking hands, and a dog that never once decided it was too much work to pull him back. 3 years of debt he could never adequately repay, being paid forward over and over by an animal who had no concept of the math and wouldn't have cared about it anyway. Havoc barked again. 3 short bursts. Clear, certain, unafraid. Declan's finger moved toward the trigger, and Elias Voss, both wrists in steel, made a decision. The barrier was old. That was the first thing Elias assessed, the kind of rapid automatic threat assessment that 12 years in naval special warfare burns into the architecture of a man's thinking until it runs below conscious thought like a second heartbeat. The crash barrier was galvanized steel, sunk into a concrete footing sometime in the early 90s, judging by the oxidation pattern, and the section his cuffs were locked to had been taking road salt and freeze-thaw cycles for 3 decades. The weld at the base had a rust bloom the size of his fist. Declan's finger was on the trigger. Havoc barked once more, shorter, urgent, the last warning before something final. Elias pulled his knees to his chest, planted both boots flat against the face of the barrier, and pushed. Not a test. Not a preliminary effort. Everything. Every pound of force his legs could generate in one simultaneous total extension, the kind of output a man only finds when the alternative is something he cannot accept. The barrier shrieked against the concrete footing, metal stressed. The rust bloom at the weld gave a sound like a single gunshot crack, sharp, percussive, swallowed immediately by the wind. The section tore free. Elias was already moving. He came off the ground, rotating the cuffs still locked around the 18-inch section of torn barrier, swinging it in a controlled arc as he rose. His body remembered the mechanics without being asked. Close quarters engagement protocol confined space opponent at 10 o'clock, weapon in right hand. The rotating movement built momentum, and Elias released it all at once, both legs scissoring up and out, in a technique that had no formal name in any manual he'd ever trained, from the kind of thing that gets improvised once in a career, and either works completely or doesn't work at all. His legs caught Declan across the upper chest. The impact was total. Declan's feet left the ground. The gun discharged into the sky, 1 round gone meaningless, and then 230 pounds of corrupt law enforcement landed flat on his back in 2 feet of packed snow, with Elias already coming down on top of him. What happened next took 11 seconds. Elias knew the count, because he always counted. It was another thing that never turned off. He got the gun first priority, always priority, securing the weapon hand at the wrist with a grip that didn't allow for repositioning, and putting the gun into the snow 6 feet away, where neither of them could reach it quickly. Then he worked from position using his weight and the leverage of the cuffs still on his wrists to control Declan's movement. And when Declan tried to bridge and roll, Elias read it 2 beats early and used the momentum against him instead of fighting it. And that was when Declan's right arm bent in a direction arms are not constructed to bend. Declan made a sound. Elias put him face down in the snow and held him there until the struggling stopped. It took another 4 seconds. Then stillness. 11 seconds total. Elias stayed kneeling on the man's back for one full breath. 2, verifying the stillness was genuine and not tactical. Then he stood. His hands were shaking, not from fear, not from the taser residue still cycling through his nervous system, but from adrenaline doing what adrenaline does when there's suddenly nowhere left to go. He turned around. Havoc was down. Not the controlled drop of a dog taking a trained position. The sideways collapse of a body that has spent everything it had and has nothing left to negotiate with. He was lying on his right side in the snow, the red in the white around him wider than it had been his chest, moving in shallow, rapid cycles that Elias could see from 10 feet away and that told him things he didn't want to know. He covered the distance in 3 strides and went down on both knees. Havoc's eyes found him immediately. That was the thing that cracked something open behind Elias's ribs. Not the wound, not the blood, but the eyes. Alert, present, pointed at Elias with the same focused, unhurried attention that had pulled him back from the Korengal Valley 18 months ago in a motel bathroom in Colorado Springs. Still on duty, still watching his face. "I got you," Elias said. His voice came out wrong, too thin. I got you, stay with me." He pressed his palm against the wound with one hand, and with the other reached into Declan's coat. The man was unconscious, breathing alive, and found the handcuff key on his belt ring. 20 seconds to get the cuffs off his own wrists. He didn't feel the torn skin underneath until he looked at it. Havoc's breathing hadn't steadied. The cruiser was running. The radio was live. The trunk was 10 feet away, its secret still locked inside, and Elias looked at it and understood that whatever was in there was why all of this had happened, and that it couldn't wait much longer. Neither could Havoc. He had to choose which way to move first. He went to the trunk first. He hated himself for it. Hated the calculus to hated that his brain ran it automatically and came up with the same answer before he'd consciously decided anything. Havoc was down. Havoc needed a vet, and warmth and hands trained for this, none of which Elias had on a closed mountain pass in a blizzard. What he could do right now with what he had was open the trunk. If there was something alive in that trunk, every second he spent not opening it was a second he was spending someone else's life. Havoc had taken a bullet to tell him that. He found the trunk key on Declan's ring, 3rd key he tried, and the lock turned with a sound so ordinary it felt wrong. A clean mechanical click. The lid came up. The cold air rushed in, and Elias looked down, and the world went very quiet inside him. She was small. 7 years old, maybe 8, he would learn later. She was 9, small for her age. Small because she hadn't been eating enough before any of this started. She was curled on her left side with her knees drawn to her chest, wrists zip-tied in front of her body, a strip of silver tape across her mouth. She was wearing a pink coat with a broken zipper and one boot. Her lips had gone the color of a bruise, but her eyes were open, dark brown eyes, and they found Elias's face with an intensity that hit him somewhere below language. Not pleading, not the glassy, evacuated look of a person who has gone somewhere internal to survive. Present. She was completely present, watching him with the focused, furious attention of a child who had decided she was not going to stop watching until someone showed up, and someone had finally showed up. Elias's throat locked. He'd been in the room when Martinez died. He'd carried Kowalski 200 meters through a firefight with a tourniquet on his own arm. He'd written letters to 4 different sets of parents, and he'd meant every word of every letter, and none of it had broken him open the way this child's open eyes broke him open. He moved. "You're okay," he said, and his voice came out steady because he made it come out steady the same way he'd made his hands steady on triggers in conditions that didn't allow for trembling. "My name is Elias. I'm going to get you out. You're okay." He got the tape off her mouth first, carefully, 2 fingers pulling from the corner, slow, and she gasped in a breath so sharp it hurt to hear. Then the zip ties Declan's utility knife from the belt, making short work of the plastic. He got his own jacket off and wrapped it around her before he'd fully thought through the physics of standing in 11-degree wind without it. "Can you feel your feet?" he asked. She nodded. Small, deliberate. "Good. That's good." He lifted her out of the trunk, and she weighed almost nothing, and he hated that she weighed almost nothing. He carried her to the cab of his truck, the engine still running, the heater still blowing, and got her into the passenger seat. She didn't make a sound the whole way. Just held onto his arm with both hands, and he felt her grip, and noted that her grip was strong, and that meant something important about her circulation, and he filed it away. "Stay here," he told her. "Lock the door after me. Do not open it unless I say my name first." She looked at him. "Elias," she said. Her voice was a wreck scraped raw, but she said it clearly. "That's right." He heard the lock click as he walked back. Havoc hadn't moved. He was in the same position, right side down, chest cycling, in those shallow, rapid increments that Elias had been refusing to count, because counting them meant tracking whether they were getting slower. He went down on his knees in the snow beside the dog and put both hands on him, one at the wound applying pressure, one flat against his ribcage, feeling for the rhythm. Still there. Thin, but there. "Hey," Elias said. "Hey, look at me." Havoc's eyes moved to his face. "You found her," Elias said. "You hear me, you found her. She's in the truck right now because of you." His voice went somewhere he hadn't authorized it to go. He pulled it back, lost it again. "You don't get to leave. You understand me. That is a direct order, and you have never once disobeyed a direct order, and you are not starting tonight." Havoc blinked, slowly. His tail moved, not a wag, just a single effortful shift of weight that lifted it an inch off the snow and set it back down. Elias pressed his forehead against the dog's neck and felt the warmth still there, fragile and real, and something in his chest came apart completely. Not quietly. Not in the controlled, managed way he'd trained himself to process loss. He made sounds he hadn't made since he was a child. Raw sounds swallowed immediately by the wind, and he held onto his dog in the snow on a closed mountain road, and he begged. He begged Havoc to stay. He reached for the police radio with his free hand. The helicopter came in from the east. Elias heard it before he saw it. The heavy rhythmic chop of rotor blades cutting through the last of the storm, which had begun dying 20 minutes after he'd raised dispatch on Declan's radio. He'd given them the sit-rep in flat-clipped sentences, one officer down and restrained, one miner recovered alive, one K9 with a gunshot wound, requiring immediate veterinary response coordinates following. The dispatcher had asked him to repeat himself twice. He'd repeated himself twice the same words in the same order, because in his experience, repeating yourself clearly was faster than getting frustrated about having to repeat yourself. Then he'd sat in the snow with Havoc's head in his lap and talked to him. Not commands. Not encouragement in the coached performance sense. Just talked. About the shelter in Pueblo where Elias had found him caged 12-second row, a dog who'd failed his first K9 certification for being in the evaluator's written assessment, too independently minded. About the drive north to Colorado Springs with Havoc riding shotgun, already acting like he'd always been there. About Martinez, who Elias had never told anyone about. Not the VA counselor, not his sister. Nobody but who Havoc had somehow always seemed to know about anyway. The way the dog would press close on the specific nights when the memory of that ditch outside FOB Salerno sat heaviest. Lily watched from the truck cab. Elias could see her face in the side mirror, the pink coat, the dark eyes, both hands pressed flat against the glass. Watching him with Havoc, the way children watch things that are true and important, and that adults try to steer them away from. He didn't steer her away. She'd earned the right to watch. The helicopter set down on the straightest stretch of road 50 yards west. 2 paramedics, a SWAT team, and a state police sergeant named Briggs, who looked at the scene, the torn barrier, the unconscious officer, the blood trail in the snow. The veteran kneeling with the wounded dog and had the good sense to assess before speaking. "Which one's the K9?" was the first thing he said. "Here," Elias said. The veterinary team came by truck 18 minutes behind the helicopter. Briggs had dispatched them the moment Elias mentioned Havoc on the radio. A detail Elias would not learn until later, and which, when he learned, it would cause him to revise his general opinion of state law enforcement considerably upward. They worked on Havoc right there in the road, in the wash of the helicopter lights, with the wind finally falling off and the snow settling into something quieter. Elias stood 6 feet back because they needed the space, and he understood needing space to work, and he watched every movement of their hands and kept his face composed the way he'd kept his face composed through things that were harder than this. He didn't entirely succeed. Declan was loaded into the helicopter in restraints, 2 SWAT officers bracketing him, 3 of his own colleagues refusing to make eye contact with him as he was carried past. One of them, a young deputy who couldn't have been more than 25, stopped next to Elias and started to say something, and stopped and started again. "We didn't know," the deputy said. "I know," Elias said. "It wasn't absolution. It wasn't meant to be." But it was true, and true was the only currency Elias had ever found worth spending. Lily's parents arrived at the hospital in Durango 40 minutes after the medevac landed. Elias was in the waiting room outside the veterinary surgical suite 2 floors below, still in his thermal shirt jacket, having stayed with Lily in the truck-dried blood on both forearms from Havoc's wound and the torn skin at his own wrists from the cuffs. He looked, he understood, like something that had been through considerable difficulty. Lily's mother found him anyway. He heard her coming quick steps, then stopping, and looked up, and she stood there for a moment, without any words, which he respected, and then she sat down next to him and took both his wrecked hands in both of hers and held them. They sat like that until the surgeon came out. The surgeon was a compact woman in her 50s named Dr. Farrell, who removed her glasses and cleaned them before she spoke, which cost Elias approximately 4 years off his life, and then she put her glasses back on and said, "He's through it. He's going to need rest and restricted movement for 6 weeks, and he'll complain about both, but he's through it." Elias put his face in his hands, not to hide, just because his face needed somewhere to be for a moment. 1 month later, the sun over the Ridgecrest Town Hall was the specific sharp gold of a Colorado October morning that makes you understand why people move there and never leave. The square was full more people than Elias had seen in one place since his discharge ceremony, and that had felt nothing like this. Governor's office had sent the medal. The governor had come himself. Havoc sat beside Elias's left leg with the patience of a dog who has decided that formal occasions are simply another form of the work, and when the governor crouched down and settled the courage citation around his neck, a bronze medallion on a blue ribbon, Havoc's tail moved in a slow, steady arc. Lily was in the front row, both boots on, between her parents. When Elias looked at her, she waved with her whole arm, the unself-conscious full-arm wave of a child who hasn't yet learned to make herself smaller, and something in Elias's face did a thing it had not done in a long time. He smiled. Not the performance of a smile, not the social mechanism, the involuntary, unguarded kind that starts somewhere internal and arrives at the surface before a man has any say in the matter. Havoc looked up at him. The amber eyes, the steady attention, the slight lean into his leg that the dog still pretended wasn't happening. Elias reached down and scratched behind the left ear. "Good boy," he said. The wind off the mountains was cold and clean and carried nothing dangerous in it at all.